Well, comrades, it's election week. Fall is in the air, so the time is perfect to talk to you guys about Rome. So let's move to the Western Mediterranean and meet some new players. We've been spending a lot of time in the East, and it doesn't mean that nothing's been going on in the Western Mediterranean. Uh, we're just arbitrarily hopping over here so we can square up for the next big boss fight the Mediterranean sees in this period. That is Rome v. Carthage, but we're not there yet because you gotta meet the Romans and briefly the Carthaginians to understand what this moment means for the history of warfare, tactics, gear, strategy. Everything changes with Rome's entry onto the Mediterranean stage. So here we are looking at the Western Mediterranean in 264 BCE at the outbreak of the First War between Carthage and Rome. These wars are also called the Punic Wars. That's because the Carthaginians are Phoenician. Phoenician is Punic in Latin, therefore Punic Wars. But we're not going to talk about that this week. No, we're going to kind of get the lead up to the territory here. So Rome is located in central Italy, and it's some pretty nice real estate in the Mediterranean. You'll notice that it's shielded by Corsica and Sardinia on the west and Sicily to the southwest. Really, the only country that has a direct line access to sail right to Rome is, Carthage. Oh dear. Well, we'll see how that works out for them next week. But Rome in general has a lot going for it defensive-wise. In a highly competitive land grab environment in the Mediterranean, Rome is just nasty enough that people aren't constantly feuding over it, unless you happen to be Italian. It, however, has some drawbacks. It's on marshy swampland. The malaria problems are endemic and massive, so much so that Rome, once it became a large city, had to constantly bring people in, otherwise it would have lost its replacement population due to disease. So by the time this conflict gets underway between Punic Wars 2 and 3, the demographics of the city of Rome changed so completely that most of the DNA we find in bodies from that period come from the Near East and North Africa. And this is partly because of immigration, but more because of the massive enslavement of people from the north of Africa and the Near East. But again, spoilers, we're not there yet. So zooming in on the area around Rome, before the 260s BCE, Rome in its early history, it's founded traditionally in 753 BCE, and while there is settlement in the archaeological record before that, this does seem to be about the time where Rome, like other city-states in the Mediterranean, is beginning to coalesce into a city. You may remember this is the Archaic period in Athens, so this is the time when Athens is beginning to consolidate into a city too, and pretty much every other city-state in the Mediterranean. So Rome isn't weird. It's doing what everybody else is doing. Similarly, there are Greek colonies all through southern Italy, so much so that Romans called the south of Italy Magna Graecia, which means big Greece. Apparently real Greece was little Greece. So many questions, Rome. To the north, the Etruscans were the established urbanized population. They do seem to have gotten their act together earlier than the Romans, and they were already innovating in a number of areas, including warfare and warfare technology. So armor, weapons, metallurgy, the Etruscans were deeply invested in it, and they were in a great place to do so, because north of the Etruscans, eventually through the Po River Valley, you're in the Alps, where iron mining. Sorry, my West Virginian comes out when I try to say iron. Anyway, iron mining is beginning to be practiced on near industrial scales, as is salt mining. This is something that the Alpine region has over other parts of the Mediterranean. It's not quite making its way to Rome yet, but that's the spoiler for upcoming slides here. So Rome begins its life as just this tiny city-state. It's not even the biggest tribal territory in Italy. Tribal defined by extended kinship networks who share a common language and culture, of which there are many in Italy. Latin is just one of several languages. Proto-Latin was spoken by the Latin tribes, which are the pink area to the south of the city of Rome. Let's see, who's to the north of Rome? I think I'd remember. I think it's, no, the Marsians are inland. Oscans, that's it. So there's Oscan, there's Tuscan, there's Etruscan. Tuscan and Etruscan, I think, are the same. And then Greek is being spoken in the south of the peninsula. So the Latin, not even spoken in the majority of Italy at the beginning of this. Whereas now, what I'm speaking to you is a highly bastardized, really roughed up version of Latin via German. So that's pretty good success for a language. It's not quite Proto-Indo-European levels of success, but you know, not everybody can be the Proto-Indo-Europeans. Rome does not grow very quickly in the beginning. When we begin this map, it's 485 BCE, so if the traditional date is correct, 753. 2.5 centuries or so into Rome's life, it's only managed to conquer the area immediately around the city itself, and not north of the Tiber. So the boundary between the pink and the green area, use my red scribbler here, is the Tiber River. Rome is only this little area around to the south, but as you'll notice, something changes around 387 BCE. Rome is in an early expansion phase. They begin to move north of the Tiber River when something happens. Something comes to Italy. What is that something, you ask? Well, the Celtic peoples is a catch-all term for the folks of Iron Age Northern Europe. So we've been spending all this time in the Mediterranean. The Mediterranean is a very different cultural, linguistic, religious, everything group from what's going on in Northern Europe. We tend to refer to Europe and Africa as separate now today because that's the kind of peopled divisions that we have in the modern world. But in the ancient world, the Mediterranean felt very far away once you got north of the Alps, although not so far that there wasn't trade. There was, especially if you lived near to large river valleys, but once you got into the northern parts of what's now France, and certainly into the interior of Germany, the Rhine and the Danube rivers here demarcate a bit of a stopping point that Rome consistently struggles around. You'll notice, however, that there's a little bit of green along the coast here. So this is a combination of Greek-speaking city-states and Carthaginian ally states. Everything on this map in green is Greek-speaking, and blue areas are those that are held by Carthage and its allies. Rome isn't on this map because it's not that relevant yet. It's still kind of a glorified county. Right. So Celt culture is a bit of a wobbly catch-all term. It's about as meaningful as saying, Native American, right? When we say Native American or Indigenous American, we're referring to a whole wide variety of peoples and nations and cultures and languages. The same is true of Northern Europe in the Iron Age. This is not a unified whole. They're not even all speaking the same language family. Celtic and Germanic languages are two different branches. And within these languages, there are many sub-languages. There are a variety of different cultures, of traditions. Eventually, there is some religious unity in the western part of Northern Europe under the Druids. Not to get ahead of ourselves, but the Druids are coming. But not penetrating into Germany, What does happen regularly enough to be a bit of a problem in the Mediterranean is that Northern Europe is sensitive to climate change to a degree you don't see in the Mediterranean. It's more stable weather-wise, they're longer growing seasons. Northern Europe, when the climate has a hiccup, has a tendency to become very hungry very quickly. And in an environment where you have disunity, warring factions, lots of iron, and food insecurity, you tend to get people picking up stakes, moving, and trying to grab other people's land. It's understandable. It's a thing. It's not that it doesn't happen in the Mediterranean either. So, in 250-ish BCE, there is what we think might be a cooling period or certainly some kind of harvest collapse going on in the very northern parts of Northern Europe. So here we're talking about what's now northern France and Germany, um, especially the Jutland Peninsula feels some of this. And again, in a century, this happens again with the Cimbri and the Teutones. So at any rate, large groups of Celtic-speaking peoples begin to pick up their families. So it's not just warring raider bands, but it's also people who are deliberately trying to go get new land and settle in better places, start moving down the major river systems into the Mediterranean. One such group is outlined in brown here along the Danube River Valley. So they broke into northern Greece and then continued on down into Anatolia. Some of them settled in the area of Turkey that's now, well, then and now known as Galatia. The Gaul part of Galatia is the same root that informs the word Gaul, like the peoples who lived in pre-Roman France were called Gauls. That's not a coincidence. That was a group who managed to successfully penetrate into the Anatolian interior, grab some land, and keep it. Gold star. If you're familiar with the New Testament, you've met these folks. These are the people who are addressed in Paul's letter to the Galatians. That's them. Now, most of these raiding parties were focused on the wealthy eastern Mediterranean, but some of them saw opportunities south of the Alps. Now, if you think about it for a minute, you understand why they'd avoid the Alps. It's a lot easier to go down a river valley than it is to cross the Alps into Italy, which is another reason why Italy is a pretty safe area. However, one enterprising Gaul by the name of Brennus in 290 BCE and his raiding band, and this was a proper raiding band, so they didn't have their families and children with them in this group. They were just there for some loot. Crossed south of the Alps and into the Italian peninsula and headed towards Rome. Now, at this point, the Romans assumed that when the Gauls hit Etruria, they'd either grab everything they wanted, be happy, and leave, or the Etruscans, with their amply funded citizen armies and their pretty well-trained military forces, would be able to stop the Gauls. Haha, it didn't work out that way. Brennus tore through Etruria and proceeded on to Rome, and I'm leaving out a lot of details here. Eventually, he breaks through the outer defenses of Rome, which wasn't that hard at that point. The Servian wall was, well, they got better. And some Romans refused to leave their homes. A lot of them retreated to the high point of the city. Most ancient cities have one of these. So there's a hill in the middle that's fortified that you run to when the poo hits the fan. Some Romans refused. They stayed in their houses. And the Gauls, as they walked into the streets of Rome, like it was quiet, it was deserted. They're like, what the heck? And then they wander into this one house just to see the Roman elders sitting there in their chairs in their receiving room with their togas on, like, yeah, you're in our house, what? And apparently the Gauls were like looking at them, and one of them decided to pull on one of the dude's beards just to make sure he was alive. And then the Roman dude hit the Gaul in the head with his walking stick. And then the Gauls proceeded to kill everyone, but it's kind of a cool story. Which brings us to what happens next. So In 387 BCE is when Brennus crosses into the city of Rome. He has the city effectively at sword point, and he makes them a deal similar to the deal he struck with the cities of Etruria. Basically, look, I want this many pounds of gold, and if you pay me, I'll leave. It sounded like a good deal, so the Romans are like, okay, sure, whatever. So they bring out the scales, and then Brennus pulls out his own weights, and wouldn't you know, his pounds are heavier than Roman pounds. So the Romans are like, dude, no fair. We meant Roman pounds, not your pounds. These pounds aren't pounds. And then Brennus is like, oh, you want to complain? And then he takes out his sword, hence the illustration, plonks it down onto the side of the scales with weights on it, thus making it even heavier. And he says, I don't know if he said this in Latin, but the historian reports it in Latin. So here you go. Vae Victis, which means woe be unto the vanquished, or more colloquially, sucks to be you. Sucks to get conquered, doesn't it? Side story. I was once playing an online role-playing game where a group had decided to call their guild Vae Victis. Now, this does still mean something in Latin, but Latin is an inflected language. The is on the end of victis makes a huge difference. Vae victa means, oh no, I'm a conquered lady, whereas vae victis means woe be unto the vanquished. Like, a key difference, I think you'd agree. So, like, I tried to tell them, and they were like, no, you're wrong. I was like, no, I have a PhD. And they're like, ha ha. Well, I tried. Vae victis. At any rate, the Romans do pay up, but a guy named Camillus decides that enough is enough. They not only have to just get rid of the Gauls, but they have to do it with extreme prejudice. And he has a catchphrase too, and here it is. If you've had Latin, this will be familiar to you, but even if not, aurum, like the AU on the periodic table is gold. Fe, like ferrum on the periodic table, that's iron. So not by gold, but by iron, that is by the sword, must the fatherland be retaken. Romans called their nation state their patria, their fatherland. They're very big into their dads, were the Romans. And it did work. Camillus managed to rally the Roman resistance. Brennus was kicked out. Rome was essentially fine, but it was a bit of a wake-up call for Rome. Rome, from this point on, realized that they were vulnerable, their neighbors weren't an adequate defense, and that they had to become very serious about recruiting, training, and perfecting their military. Now, not just because of the Gauls. Italy was getting increasingly competitive between Italian city-states as land became more and more tied up by large landowners, and people were beginning to feel population strain, like most of the rest of the Mediterranean too. And it didn't help that Greece kept sending colonists overseas. So, where to look for inspiration? Here is where Rome made some shrewd grabs. Romans were pretty cool about picking up any idea they thought was useful and interesting. They tended to respond to other people's brilliance, sometimes with a little bit of inadequacy, but more by imitating, grabbing, borrowing. And it's not that other people in the Mediterranean didn't do this either, but part of why Rome could afford to experiment a little bit is that it hadn't, at this point, invested too heavily in a traditional phalanx structure. Now, when our story begins, Rome is using a phalanx with a citizen army, just like everybody else in the Mediterranean is. It was the trendy thing in the Archaic period. But in the 4th century, so in the 300s moving into the 200s, they started to use weapons designed off of forms coming out of Celtic peoples in Northern Europe. So here we are looking at an artist reconstruction of what Gallic warriors looked like. And we have a lot of information about this due to excavations at a site called Laten. This is a place where we found a large amount of iron weapons and gear, and there's artwork. So we're very sure about how these folks looked. And because they were raiding into the Mediterranean on the regular, historians from outside of their culture were commenting on what they looked like too. And as I'm sure you've noticed already, one of these people is not wearing a lot of clothes. Now, I mentioned when we were talking about heroic nudity that one of the reasons we know that heroic nudity is an art thing and not something that actual Greek hoplites were doing is because when people showed up naked on the battlefield, Greek authors were like, oh my gosh, they're actually naked. Yeah, this is that moment. So not all, but some Gallic warriors preferred to go onto the battlefield naked except for their sword and their helmet, and this is a psychological move. There are a few things more intimidating than a naked dude coming at you with a sword. It's impressive. When you see that person, you're like, oh, they look like they know what they're doing, and they seem very confident out there. And my gosh, it's cold out here, so dang, that person must be tough. I avoid maybe? But also, if you want to impress your own men, this is a great way to get a reputation for badassery if you manage to live, because, well, you're naked and you lived. So this was not something that every Gallic warrior was doing, but enough of them were doing it that it drew comment. One of the other things Mediterranean people would notice, and this is something Northern Europeans would often play up, they'd paint their bodies with a combination of blue paint made from the woad plant and then chalk to make themselves look even paler, because to the Mediterranean, folks coming out of Northern Europe look like freakishly pale, and it kind of startled and weirded folks out well into the 1st century CE. The historian Tacitus, writing about Germania, which is in the general area where modern Germany is, was like, they are ridiculously pale and they're all redheaded and they all look the same. What's up with that? Yeah, so that was a thing that you could play up even more if you didn't have any clothes on your blue and white painted body. And then you come out of the alpine mists, you know, roaring and shaking your nice quality iron in somebody's face. It's startling. So, more prosaic, but much more important is the shield shape. These shields are made with a center grip, and they vary between an oval shape for foot soldiers and a round shape used in cavalry folk. The oblong shape is a new take on the tower shield. So this kind of shield circulates in the Mediterranean and elsewhere ever since the Bronze Age. Like, this is not a new concept. But this oval shape is a nice compromise between sturdiness, coverage, and mobility. The oval shape allows you to turn around and move more freely than you can in an overlapping round shield wall. And with the center grip, you can angle and maneuver your shield more precisely. Now, you're going to get more arm fatigue. You don't have the porpox and the entelabe stabilizing the shield, and you don't have it resting on your shoulder. So you have to be stronger and have more endurance to manage one of these well. But they have all of the advantages we saw back with the dipylon or figure 8 shield in the Bronze Age, without the little divot in the middle and without the bendiness. These are made of layers of laminated wood with a central spine along the middle. I'm going to highlight this in the red. So this spine is typical of Celtic and early Roman shield shapes. You'll also see ones like this where it's a little bit more squared off, but look for the spine. That's a dead giveaway that you're looking at Celtic or early Roman. In the center boss, there's this oblong rectangular shape slapped perpendicularly to the spine. So this creates reinforcement over the hand. It strengthens the shield so it doesn't buckle over the small bones of your hand, and it also gives added oomph when you punch someone in the face with your shield, which is partly what the boss is for, but this is also a stress point where weapons tend to bang a lot. So you're using the minimal amount of metal where it's going to do the maximum amount of good. There's a reinforcing ridge around the edge. That's an important part of the shield design too. This is sturdy, reasonably light, and a very reliable way to block blows, but it doesn't use a ton of wood. It's not that hard to make, so it's a nice workhorse shield, and it's flexible for maneuvering, especially if you want to switch lines mid-fight, which is where we're going with this. One last thing, while there isn't a large cavalry presence among Celtic peoples in any period, well, no, not any period, depending on where you are in Northern Europe, you're going to have more or less cavalry presence. So it is something that happens, but it's something that's reserved, as it is elsewhere in the Mediterranean, for upper class people. So this is an elite thing. You have to be wealthy enough to afford the horse. Oh yes, also the helmet shape. Ignore the giant bird on the top, which is a thing. Stuffed taxidermied eagles and vultures and such were something that Celtic warriors would wear on the top of their helmets. But this shape where you've got a knob on the center and a kind of pilos-shaped head-hugging cap with cheek pieces coming down, this time made of iron, this is something we're going to see in a minute when we look at our early Roman legionaries. Oh wait, we're not there yet. Here we're going to look at some of the remains that have informed this reconstruction, including one of my favorites. So this is a gold coin, here circled in red up there at the top, that is thought to be the goddess Epona. She was the goddess of horses and cavalry. There are a few warrior goddesses both in Italy and in Northern Europe. The Roman Bellona springs to mind. It's not even just Rome. Athena is a thing. You'll notice that in her one hand there's a long, sturdily shaped triangular sword. In her other hand, an oval shield with a spine down the center and then a bisecting boss. And then below her horse, as it's leaping, there's a harp, or a lyre, actually. A lyre is a better technical term for what that instrument is. We think this is associated with the Vates, or bards, which was a class of folks very similar to the oral poets that composed the Iliad and the Odyssey. So we have here a small brooch. So this is a bit of jewelry made to look like a shield, so it's novelty brooch, but it's great evidence. And then another coin here. This is from the south of Gaul, with the typical shield shape here, and then on the reverse side, possibly a river god, we're not quite sure, some sort of local deity, but the coin motifs do look a lot more Mediterranean, because much as the Romans try to act like the Celts are completely disconnected from the civilization of the sea, the south of France exists, so, you know. So here they are, lined up next to each other, now an artist's rendition. So on the left is a Celt. The way that you, if you were an ancient Roman, would tell that you were looking at a Celt was by the torque. So it's floating above his head, but he would actually be wearing this around his neck. So a torque is a twisted metal neck ring that, if you were very, very fancy, would be made out of gold, less fancy silver than bronze. You know, you get the idea. And this was a sign of nobility. And yes, Mr. Spouse has his, so allow me to demonstrate. See, it's torque. It's all bendy. This one's made out of bronze because we're not a fancy pair of Celts. And there we go. Now I'm Boudica. So Romans eventually began capturing these and then wearing them as trophies, because these were the iconic thing you looked for if you were trying to ID a Gaul. And you had to look for the torque because Romans look a lot like Gauls by the time we get to the late 300s, 200s BCE, and indeed for quite a while afterwards. So the helmet types are similar, more similar than these artists are making out, actually. So the Celt here does not have a knob on the top of his helmet, although lots of Celts did. The Romans here have a, the typical sort of mohawk-shaped crest on the top of their helmets, along with the two extra feathers to the side. The two extra feathers to the side are legit. That kind of comb thing we do see in this period attached to that knob, but also the knob was used for horsehair plumes or just single feathers. It was a way of showing rank and increasing visibility on the battlefield. Now, as with other armies we've looked at, and indeed this is true for the entire period we're dealing with, there's no uniform. And this is especially true of Romans in this period. So just like Greek hoplites, Romans aren't all carrying around shields that have the same SPQR logo on them. That's not how any of this works in a pre-modern society, right? There's not a massive shield industrial complex churning out Roman army issued anything. In this early period, just like in archaic Greece, individual legionaries were buying their own equipment and upgrading. They were inheriting them from their fathers and so on and so forth. So you had to be able to afford this stuff. And that informs some of the fashion choices we see here as well. You'll notice that the Celt is wearing a chainmail shirt. That is correct. We begin seeing chainmail coming out of Northern Europe into Italy in this period. And it's made of small rings of riveted steel. And the advantages of chainmail over plate is that chains are easily repaired in the field. They bend and they flex with the wearer. They absorb impacts. Now, they'll transfer it to your body, but that can sometimes be more helpful when you're trying to slow down projectiles. Although, for my money's worth, I'd probably go with the linothorax still. And it's a way of showing your status as well. You'll notice the Roman is wearing chainmail too, but look at the shoulders. So the shoulders are cut like the linothorax. Romans are using chainmail, but they're putting it into a more Mediterranean fashion forward cut. So they're basically making a linothorax out of chainmail. And this is typical for Roman chainmail options right on through the period we'll be covering here. Next to him, and we'll be looking at better pictures of this in a minute, you'll notice that there's this plate of bronze just covering the upper chest there, kind of strapped on to the front. That is, it's called a heart protector because that's what it does. It is a plate of metal put where it's going to do the most good if you are, say, on a metal budget. But it also keeps your weight down. It provides maximum mobility. It's not a horrible idea. Part of the idea here was that not protecting the back wasn't a bug, it was a feature. The thought went, if you protect your back, that must mean you're willing to turn your back to the enemy. And if you get wounded on your back, well, we know what that means. So if you're not worried about your back, you have the proper attitude, because your front should always be facing the enemy. I can kind of see where they're going with this. But this was a big macho thing in the Mediterranean where warriors would be like, yeah, I've been wounded 32 times and all on the front. And, braggable. I'll give them that. That's, I can't make fun of them too much. Let's see, anything else I want to point out here? Now, there are some familiar sights as well. You'll notice the greaves look just like greaves have looked since, well, the Bronze Age almost. Similarly, the helmets aren't that different from the Mediterranean, and this is partly because there are only so many ways to put a dome on your skull. But there doesn't seem to be a period where they're using the 4th century bulb-topped helmets that we saw in Macedon. They keep with this simpler kind of skull cap configuration. All right, so here we're looking at 2 artifacts. On the left, there is one of the many swords we found at Laten. That's a sword that's completely cast in one piece, which is unusual. Normally the blade has a tang that's inserted into a wooden grip that connects the blade to the pommel. This, however, has been cast in one piece, and it's you can tell it's iron because you can see that red rusting pattern. Pretty nifty, huh? So the point of this... Oh, that was a horrible pun. Right. The point of this sword is on the bottom, but it is also that whoever owned this thing had enough iron to make their sword with extra iron in it. But this would have been heavy but deadly if you could wield it properly. The blade shape looks a little bit like what we saw with the Greek xiphos. It's got a bit of a swell near the tip, but not the exaggerated olive leaf shape that we get in the Greek xiphos. This is much straighter, and the blade is sturdier and a bit stouter. So this is a blade that is meant for deep stabbing, and the very long tapering point on the end is the business end of this thing. Now it's sharpened on both sides, so your goal with this blade is either to slip it into the groin or the armpit where major arteries are flowing so that you can exsanguinate your victim, or this is made for efficient stabbing and re-stabbing. You can use it to hack, of course. Any self-respecting sword you can, but this is more of a short thrusting stabby sort of sword. Now looking on the right, we have a complete Roman gladius, a much later one, but you'll notice it's very similar. There isn't as much iron in it. This was likely an officer's blade, but it's not incredibly wealthy as far as Roman blades go. It's a business-like sort of gladius. It's still in its sheath, which is what you're seeing on the outside. So this tooled metal casing in bronze was the outside of the leather scabbard. So inside there would have been leather and wood, and then the blade is very well preserved. Iron has a tendency to oxidize into nothing over time, so this is a particularly nice one. And it's still got its pommel and hilt too. The grip is ivory. It would have been covered with leather when it was in use in order to improve the grip. So if you use just plain ivory, as blood begins to coat the end of your sword, blood is very slippery, but also, and this may seem a little contradictory, it's tacky, but this combination of slipperiness and tackiness means that your hand slides and then sticks if you don't have really good traction. So if you have a sword like this where you are repeatedly stabbing people and trying to exsanguinate them, you are going to need leather wrapping on the hilt. Next to it, there is this is a late Roman boss, like late as in 2nd century, but you can see the essentials haven't changed much from Celtic bosses. So Celtic bosses would have ended here and here, but it's got the central swelling. This would cover the center of the shield, and that's where the grip goes. So a few more words about the Gladius Hispaniensis, or the Roman gladius. Gladius is their word for sword. It's related to the word gladiator. A gladiator is a person who fights with a gladius for funsies. Not their funsies, everybody else's funsies. Gladiators are generally enslaved people being forced to fight. That's not cool. So as I mentioned, these share a lot in common with Celtiberian swords specifically. So here is a Celtiberian sword. Iberia is the name of the peninsula that modern-day Spain is on. So Celtiberians are Celtic-speaking peoples who are living in modern-day Spain or around the Pyrenees. So much like the Alps, the Pyrenees produce particularly nice metals, and it was a center for metalwork and metal trading. Here is another Spanish Celtic longsword compared to a Mainz type gladius. So this was found in Mainz, Germania, modern-day Germany, at the remains of a Roman fortification. And next to it we have one of the rare surviving examples of a Roman wood pommel. So the leather isn't there anymore, but you can see the wood that would have encased the hilt of the sword. Very efficient, no frills sword, the gladius. Not particularly fiddly to make necessarily, but a really effective weapon. And as I said, quite short. When you're wearing it, it's going to go down to about your knee. And Romans were fairly short by and large, so that this isn't a very long sword. It's mine, the blade is about the length of my forearm plus a little bit of hand. Actually, do you have the gladius?
Yes.
Ah, thank you. Mr. Spouse is getting my gladius. My practice gladius. I don't have a real one, alas. So while he does that, your gladius goes on a Cingulum and Balteus. So a Cingulum is the horizontal belt that goes around your waist. The gladius itself is affixed to the Balteus. So the Balteus is the Roman baldric, essentially. So this is a cross-braced strap that goes over your shoulder across like a purse strap or a messenger bag. Now, the sword itself hangs not on your left side, so you're not opposite drawing your sword. Rather, the gladius hangs loosely from your side at the right, or if you're lefty, I guess you'd use your left hand. Right hand does seem to be the normal gladius hand, though. Although there were some left-handed gladius users, especially people who'd had their right hand chopped off, so then they become lefties because, of course. So, suspended from the Balteus, you grab the hilt like so, kind of with your hand cocked around, and then you draw it out in kind of a forward motion. So you don't have to draw a crossbody. It's a short enough sword that you can draw out and poke so that you don't hit the people next to you. And that's why the Balteus is hanging loosely, so it's only attached to the belt at one end to give you more swing in your sword placement. Now, the Cingulum itself sometimes has these straps with studs hanging off the front of it. This is, sometimes you'll see people hypothesizing this is kind of a groin protector, only this isn't a great way to protect your groin by and large. Oh, great, he found the gladius, right? So, gladius, here we go.
And even then, that gladius...
Yeah, this is a really large gladius. This is a little silly long, actually, which is why it's so dang hard to draw. Well, here, it works on him. Go. Check out the giant dude in this gladius.
I'd say this is more of a late Roman-style gladius, almost bordering on a spatha, which is more of a cavalry-style, longer, narrower blade form.
And it's got this weird exaggerated Pompeii tip on it, too.
Yeah, the thing I'd say is roughly from where my hand to the pommel here grip, let me get it better in frame, that's more in your range of something that's 18 to about 20 inches as the blade itself. The other thing is the metallurgy of this period, if you went longer, you risked a brittler, bendy, breaking. So actually having a shorter, stouter blade meant the blade and the metal actually lasted longer in battle.
Awesome. Thank you, spouse. All right, let's see what we're doing. Yes. So these little hangy things in the front seem to be just decorative. They might have confused the eye a little bit if you're trying to stab a Roman in the groin, but they're not going to be too helpful for that. Okay, next up, we need to talk about the difference between a pilum and a hosta. So as I mentioned, hosta in Latin means a javelin. So this is the thrown spear, and it's just like the javelins we saw back in archaic Greece. That doesn't really change, down to the rifling thongs that you have along the edge to throw it with. But the Romans began using a kind of throwing spear called a pilum in the same period that the manipular legion is becoming perfected. And this is the pilum. So a pilum has half of a wooden haft here, and then a weighted collar at the midpoint, and then a metal narrow throat, and then this fluted point on the end. And this is because a pilum is not an offensive weapon meant to stick in another body. Rather, this is a shield neutralizing spear. So what the pilum does is it penetrates deep with its long pointy tip into the enemy's shield, and then the weight of this midsection combined with the wood on the end pulls it downwards so that the neck here, where it's very narrow, bends. And what you end up with is a shield that has this big honkin' pilum stuck in the front of it, but it's bent, so you can't pull it out and then throw it back at the Romans. It's a one-shot weapon. And that's important because one of the drawbacks to a javelin is that if you can throw it, they can throw it back. So with a pilum, you're going to be using up a lot more metal. It's more resource intensive to create that long tip. You also need to be better at weapons manufacturing. But when you hit people on the shields, which is kind of easy to do, shields are a good target, you manage to disarm the front line right before you charge into them. So it's a nice trick. Here are a few examples of surviving pilum heads, including this in here, which is my favorite. You can see it's still bent. So this is a used pilum that has been stuck in somebody's shield, got twisted, and then some person threw it away in disgust because, Romans hate them. Now, it's not just Romans using this. This kind of pilum is a pan-Italian thing, but Romans really take it on the road, as it were, and it becomes one of the staples in their arsenal. So here are a comparison of other pilum halves. You can see that it's very variable in length, but the big thing to look for is you've got this narrow throat with a heavy weight on the middle. Now, as I said, Roman chainmail looked a lot like the same pattern we were using for our linothorax, just in chain. And here's what this looks like. This is a modern reproduction, of course. Chainmail tends not to survive very well. Romans called this the Lorica Hamata. So Hamata is just their word for netted or woven. And then on the other panel, you can see Romans modeling several different kinds of pectoral plate or chest plate or heart protector. Any of those descriptions is fine for this gadget. This is the front of your body strap-on chest plate thingy. We'll be looking at some archaeological examples in a minute. One thing I do want to point out, the reversed swastika doesn't mean that early Romans were Nazis. This is something Hitler ruined for everyone forever, as you do. Okay, next up. These may not seem like important military innovations to you, but oh, they are. The Caligae, the army boots, and the focale, the scarf. So first, the Caligae. This is a kind of boot that has a strappy, breathable sole, or upper rather, that's laced with the tips pointing outwards, so that this ridge along the top edge of the foot makes the leather point out so that it doesn't rub against the foot on the top of the arch and cause blistering, which is a real worry when you're marching around the Mediterranean for miles on end. This could be worn with an early sort of sock. Roman socks were woven. Knitting hadn't been invented yet. In later periods, you also get nail binding, which is an early form of kind of sort of knitting, but not really. The soles are made of multiple layers of leather with these hobnails punched into them, and they stick out like soccer cleats because they're like soccer cleats. These are essentially cleat boots, which are great if you need to, say, stomp on somebody's foot, or if you need to not slip around on a muddy battlefield. These are very practical. You can dress them up for winter by stuffing them with things. In summer, you can dress them down so that your feet can breathe nicely. They're easy to make in the field. The leather uppers are pretty easy to replace. Romans, once they had long-standing units away from home, one of the things that they would requisition from local suppliers was lots and lots of leather, in part to make sure that there was a steady supply of Caligae. And this is the back of an actual Roman Caligae. This is from Vindolanda on Hadrian's Wall in Britain. And you can see here that there's flat seam stitching on the back side. So this protects the Achilles tendon, but with a flat seam, it's not going to rub the back of your foot. So this is blister-proofing technology and also tendon-saving armor. These are really quite brilliant, and they never go out of fashion. Romans wear these right on up through. A classic's a classic for a reason. So much so that we found Roman army boot prints all over the empire, preserved where mud is dried, and some of them seem to have stamped on tiles before they got fired, which is nice. So the focale is, as I said, the scarf that these soldiers are wearing around their necks, these nice late Republican soldiers. So they're a little later than the period we're at here, but you can see that, actually, no, this is Trajan's Wall, or Trajan's Column, never mind, this is Imperial. They're cavalrymen, hence the funky shield shape. The focale is a scarf that you wear to protect your neck from friction, from your carry sacks, from your armor, from anything else going around on your neck, which is important. Armor chafes, it's heavy, it pulls on your bones. As the day goes on, it can get really, really painful, like you haven't lived until you've had armor burn on your neck. So the focale helps to offset friction. In hot climates, you can dip it in water to keep yourself from getting heat stroke as quickly. In cold climates, you can use it to stuff up your neck so you don't freeze on Hadrian's Wall. And it's useful for, straining mud out of your water in an emergency or tying up wounds. It's a hanky. But not all military technology is just military. And these small items were essential parts of a Roman's kit that they'd get super upset about if they didn't have handy. So it's something to look for when you look at ancient art with Roman soldiers, is their focale. And it's something to watch for in modern movies, because often costumers leave the focale out. And also they seem to really like putting Romans in leather Lorica segmentata for some reason, which is stupid. Next up, underwear. It's important, but maybe you've wondered, well, what was Roman underwear like? Well, it's pretty much the same design we've been seeing since the Cingulus. That is, you have a piece of cloth pulled between your legs and kind of tucked up over a belt. This is important for the reasons underwear is important, right? You don't want to be dangling your vulnerables out on a battlefield, but you also need to be able to hitch up your dangly bits in order to be comfortable while you're fighting. This also helps with chafing issues, and Romans do talk about having thigh chub rub issues in the field. Eventually, in the later Roman army, soldiers begin wearing trousers under their armor, at first just in their field uniform, but eventually it becomes part of the kit. But for the period we're talking about, although trousers were available, Northern Europeans loved them some trousers. Romans didn't feel like it was appropriate for Romans to wear pants. Like, pants are for foreigners. They also thought that, if you wore pants too long, you would squish your testicles and turn into a lady, which is an interesting theory. Just goes to show you, gender constructions change. So next up, we've got some helmet types. The one on the left is the one we've been seeing all along. So this is the Montefortino type helmet. And this is a northern Italian kind of helmet style that is typical of Roman legionaries right into the empire, really, but especially the legions of the Republic. So manipular legions, Caesar's men would have been wearing these too. But it's not the only helmet type available. There is also what I think is one of the silliest named helmet types in the ancient Mediterranean, the Coolus helmet. Yes, really. It sounds like something Snoopy would wear because it's cool. And we're Roman, so we put us on the end of words. But no, that's what it's called. It's a Coolus helmet, and it looks like a ball cap because it's cool. Yeah. All the joking aside, this is a sensible way to put a helmet together, and we see this helmet type particularly for cavalry people because it shades your eyes really well, and it also shields you from blows coming from above. Often there'll be a neck protector in the back, so sometimes they'll have like a mullet on them. Most of the time, though, it's just the front visor. You can see there are rivet holes in this particular Coolus. That's from the cheek pieces. They've since fallen off, so we're just looking at a broken helmet top here. Next up are shield shapes. Some of this is a bit of a preview. The scutum doesn't become widely used by the Roman army until we get into the 1st century BCE. So in the period we're talking about, shields look more like the catratus, this long oval shield with a circular boss. The spine you see in earlier periods. The parma is a small round buckler shield, and the parma often has a porpox and entelabe because you use it to shield yourself while you're riding, and you want more stability on your forearm when you're doing that. Explain what I mean by that using this precious artifact. This is fantastic. So this is the Fayum Scutum. It was found in Fayum in Upper Egypt. So this is the northern area of Egypt. It dates to the 1st century BCE. So it's a little later than the period we're talking about now. It's one of the few shields to have survived almost entire from antiquity because shields got used hard and put away wet. They did not survive well because the point of the shield is that you beat it up to not get beat up yourself. And also they're made out of wood and leather, only a few little metal bits, so they rot away very quickly. But not in Egypt. Egypt is hot, Egypt is dry, wood tends to dry out and preserve well, and that's what's happened with this scutum, which is great for us because you can see the construction of the shield in the way that these boards are lain over each other. So here's that central spine I was talking about, here made out of wood. So the metal boss is gone. There would have been a metal boss overlaying this part here, but the wooden spine has thin strips of wood woven around it. So it's peeking out here and then dipping under there. You can see it here in this photograph as well. And there are multiple layers of wood in the shield. You can see looking at the back here where there are horizontal and vertical layers sandwiched over top. So it's a 3-layer shield. This would then have been covered with canvas or leather, or both canvas and leather, and then cured into a solid-ish surface, and then you would have put another piece of oiled leather on top of it to keep the rain off, because rain on your shield is going to make it do what laminates do when you get them wet and don't take care of them. So around the edge you can see where there are these holes picked for stitching, and that would have attached a leather binder around the edge. Sometimes this would be metal, but leather is better. It's more flexible, it's less heavy, it's just a good economical choice for your shield binding. You can see a little bit, and we'll look at this on the next page too, where one of the cross braces extends over a hole cut out in the center of the shield. That is the grip, and it's made horizontally across the inside surface of the shield so that your fist is sitting like this inside the shield. So you can flex it up, you can flex it down, you can use your elbow for side-to-side motion. So if you have your hand like this, your wrist is rapidly going to get tired from holding the weight of the shield, so you need that grip to be horizontal, like that. So here's another diagram so you can see it up close. Didn't have a ton of other comments, just here it is. Isn't it pretty? And there you can see where the cutout is for the hand. The boss would be attached around the outside surface of the shield. And you also notice how the shield curves around a little bit too. It's not a flat board, it's a curved half cocoon. That's important. The shield curves around you, so it protects you from the side a bit without losing your visibility. This is just a brilliant way to make a shield. It's so cool that we have this thing. Here is an umbo. This is the shield boss, this metal reinforcement at the center of a shield. This is a particularly fancy one. We found it amongst the offerings at a temple, and you can see here where someone has inscribed it with Greek. So this is the person dedicating it to the god at the shrine there. When you dedicated things, you'd kind of write, this is for the god so-and-so, my name is such and such. Hey, remember me, Mr. God. On the sides, and this is what I love most about this particular fancy boss, it's a shield boss with little shields on it for decoration. It's adorable, isn't it? It's a shield with shields on it. It's a meta shield. I've been locked in my apartment for too long. This particular shield seems to have suffered some damage, so either that dent is from it being used in battle, or sometimes they would deliberately break things before they offered them to the gods to make sure that that thing could never be used again. So you would ritually kill the weapon before you deposited it. So this might have been damage at the time of offering, or sometimes you would promise that if you lived through a battle, you would give to the god your spoils, either part or in whole. So it could be battle damage, it could be offering damage. In its life, though, this would have had a nice round projecting dome that would have protected the user's hand. The grip of the shield is cut right into the wood, so your hand is resting within this dome, projecting out a bit from the plane of the shield itself. So here is one reenactor's reconstruction of the shield. We sometimes find little rivets that we think attached to either a carrying strap or a shoulder strap that would help to distribute the weight. And you can see here where the metal boss is visible inside the spine. So this is the remains of one of those leather shield covers I was talking about. This was found in Germany. This is, again, near Mainz. And the leather fell into peaty soil, which was able to preserve it. It's not in great shape, but you can still see there are these lighter leather appliques on the front. This is a seahorse or a hippocampus. And then at the center, there's leather reinforcement to put extra padding over the boss so it wouldn't wear away as much. This was likely the mascot animal for this particular legion. So as close as they get to legionary uniforms, or they'll have a theme animal that'll be on their logos and things.